when you feel misunderstood. A guided meditation on letting go right now. A hot, prickling stiffness is running directly down the outer seams of your shoulders, wrapping tightly around your shoulder blades like an overly restrictive wool cloak. It is the raw physical residue of feeling perpetually misinterpreted, misjudged, or rejected by those you have tried so hard to belong among. You feel a deep systemic fatigue from wearing an emotional mask all day, constantly translating your true thoughts into a forced script just to avoid the sting of cold opinions. This bitter exile has left you feeling entirely misunderstood, as if your genuine nature is an inconvenience to the world around you. You are lying awake, bracing your upper body against the mattress, treating this deep sense of social alienation as a permanent scar that you must hide or constantly explain away. The atmosphere in your room holds a dense, protective humidity, a heavy and stabilizing calm that feels completely isolated from the sharp, critical eyes of the public square. The air is thick with a gentle, damp warmth, carrying the subtle, clean scent of fresh cedar shavings and sweet, wild plant resins that immediately work to cushion your mind from the harsh noise of the day. Your mattress provides a deep, unyielding bed of support beneath your tired shoulders, accepting your complete physical presence without demanding that you present a polished image or correct a single misconception tonight. There are no expectations to meet within this dim shelter, and no social performance is being extracted from your vulnerable spirit while you rest. Your shoulder blades can widen completely, entirely relieved of the exhausting, defensive labor of holding up a false front against the world. You are not fundamentally flawed, and this sharp ache of being misinterpreted is not a sign that your spirit is broken or unworthy of true connection. It is merely a sensitive, beautiful heart trying its best to coat its raw edges in a thick, protective layer of internal silence, shielding you from judgments you never deserve to carry. Tonight, there is absolutely no need to force yourself to feel accepted by the crowd, and we are not going to demand that you step out into the open wind to prove your transparency. We are only going to retreat together into a dark, humid cellar chamber carved deep into a quiet clay bank, allowing your true nature to cure in its own enclosed space without requiring a single eye to validate its gloss. There is a strange, painful paradox in the way the mind tries to handle the sting of public misinterpretation and unearned criticism. The mind mistakenly assumes that to survive a cold environment, it must constantly project its light outward, searching for a flawless mirror in the opinions of others to prove it has a right to exist. We look at the distorted judgments of the world and we treat them as a permanent indictment that we must tirelessly fight to reshape or bitterly retreat from. But ancient Buddhist wisdom reveals that your true identity is not a static object to be painted by the whims of a critical community. It is a fluid, deep stream that finds its ultimate protection not by demanding that others see it clearly, but by retreating into its own self-contained depth, where outside words simply slide off like rain moving across a perfectly hardened resin shield. Maybe you have felt this too, during those late hours when a critical comment from a manager or a cold look from a family member plays on a continuous loop inside your forehead, making you feel completely invisible. It is an exhausting way to spend the evening, using your own thoughts to reinforce the walls of your exile, turning your resting space into an interrogation room where you must defend your right to be understood. You do not have to win the approval of your community during these still hours, and you do not need to dissolve the misconceptions of others before your body is permitted to settle into the dark. In a short while, we will travel down into a subterranean wooden-walled moist chamber behind a high ravine waterfall, where an old master lacquerer shows us how a simple wooden vessel achieves its enduring luster away from the wind. But before we journey into that humid, dark sanctuary, let your physical body fully accept the safety of this immediate room. You are resting in a private cavern where nobody is measuring your social worth, and nobody is interpreting your silence as a mistake. The loud, distorted projections of the sun cannot penetrate the thick, damp architecture of this evening, leaving you entirely free to soften into the stillness without a single word to explain. Let the outer edges of your shoulders sink heavily into the bedding, allowing the solid floor beneath you to take the full, physical weight of your defensive armor. Your breath does not need to be forced into a rigid, artificial pattern right now, and there is no requirement to perform a complex meditation technique to satisfy a standard of healing. Just notice the warm, moist air as it enters your nostrils, and the long, quiet release that leaves your chest as your torso settles into the surface of the bed. Every incoming breath is a soft arrival in a world where you are already completely known to yourself. And every outgoing breath is a quiet invitation for the burning stiffness around your shoulder blades to expand, spreading out into the wider gravity of your resting frame. What if the validation you have been fighting to receive from the world is an empty shadow that can never truly warm your skin? What if the peace you want is already present, waiting just beneath the frantic protective masks you have used to shelter your sensitive spirit? Tonight, there are no conversations to repair, no reputations to defend, and no pressure to dissolve your internal exile in a single hour. The deep, damp spaces of your soul can remain completely unmapped. The darkness can hold you without demanding a single compromise, and you can allow the raw wooden vessel of your heart to simply find its own flawless alignment in the cool, humid night. The awareness begins to drift away from the immediate room, following a hidden path that drops steeply into a deep, misty ravine behind the roar of a high mountain waterfall. Step by step, the air becomes noticeably thick and humid, holding a heavy, tropical moisture that remains completely untouched by the dry mountain winds above. At the bottom of the ravine, carved directly into a dark clay bank, lies a subterranean wooden-walled moist chamber. The atmosphere here smells intensely of sweet vegetable sap, fresh cedar shavings, and the clean mineral wetness of damp moss. This is a secluded, hidden workshop where the darkness is so heavy it feels physical. A sheltered architecture of moist timber that has been shielded from the harsh daylight for generations. Working within the shadows of this humid vault was a young apprentice named Rin. Rin had spent many months carrying a hot, prickling stiffness along the outer edges of his shoulders, a painful sensation of absolute exile that made him feel entirely separated from the wealthy merchants of the town. He believed he possessed a fundamental flaw in his capacity to be understood, convinced that no matter how hard he worked, his true nature would always be misinterpreted and rejected by the public square. To escape the constant, exhausting sting of feeling misjudged, he tried to create beautifully decorative lacquer boxes out in the open wind of the upper courtyard, hoping the bright sunshine would make his work clear and acceptable to the passing crowds. To apply the sticky raw sumac sap onto the uneven pine wood, Rin utilized a cracked, rough horn-handled spatula. This ancient, flat tool felt stiff in his tight fingers, its worn edge catching on the grain of the wood as he tried to spread the thick crimson liquid with frantic, defensive speed. Rin spent hours out on the stone terrace, staring at the glossy surface under the harsh glare of the noon sun, desperately trying to polish away every imperfection before anyone could criticize his ability. He wanted his vessels to show a flawless, immediate perfection that would force the merchants to validate his worth, believing that true safety meant achieving an unassailable outer image that needed no explanation. On this particular afternoon, as a sudden gust of wind rattled the high cedar branches above the courtyard, Rin applied a thick final layer of crimson sap to his finest wooden bowl. He used his horn-handled spatula to smooth the surface, making sure the edges were perfectly even, ensuring that not a single brush stroke remained visible to a critical eye. But the moment he lifted the tool, the open mountain wind carried hundreds of invisible dust motes and tiny bits of dried pine needle directly onto the wet resin. The moving air caused the raw sap to blister and pit, creating a scarred, rough finish that completely ruined the smooth surface, turning his hard work into a ruined, uneven mess before his eyes. Rin fell back against the stone wall, his fingers sticky with sap, his chest heaving with a deep, suffocating sense of inadequacy as he stared at the pitted wood. He felt a hot surge of humiliation rising down the outer seams of his shoulders, interpreting the ruined bowl as a definitive proof that he was incapable of creating anything of value, or ever fitting into the community above. He sat in the dry dirt of the terrace, his hands trembling, completely overwhelmed by the crushing weight of trying to please a crowd that could not see his true intent. Master Sano, an old master lacquerer and vessel keeper who spent his decades maintaining the deep subterranean moisture chambers, did not call out from the path, and he did not rush to clean the ruined wood. His heavy straw sandals made a slow, rhythmic, scuffing sound on the stone as he approached from the entrance of the damp cellar, his movements carrying the unhurried stability of the clay bank itself. He stood before the scarred bowl, his face completely neutral as the dim light caught the deep lines of his weathered forehead. He reached out with his rough, stained hand, gently taking the cracked horn-handled spatula from Rin's trembling fingers, letting the flat edge rest on his palm. He did not offer an immediate lecture on carpentry, and he did not help Rin scrape away the blistered resin. He simply held the stiff horn tool steady, using its rough edge to point toward the heavy oaken door of the humid cellar chamber, and asked Rin why the wild sumac tree hides its sap deep within the dark bark rather than spreading it across the leaves. Rin looked at the ancient spatula, his breath catching in his throat, whispering that the sap only remains fluid and strong when it is completely protected from the drying wind and the harsh glare of the sun. The old master nodded slowly, his thumb tracing the worn, uneven handle of the spatula without a single hint of tension. He remarked that the raw resin does not achieve its enduring glass-like luster by fighting to dry itself in the open wind, or by demanding that the passing crowd admire its wet surface. It cures into an impenetrable, flawless shield, precisely because it is brought down into the dark, humid enclosure of the earth, where the heavy moisture allows the liquid layers to bind slowly into an unyielding structure. Sano explained that Rin's vessel had pitted because the young man was demanding that a sensitive, living material mature under the volatile currents of the public square, rather than allowing its surface to settle in the quiet sanctuary of the cellar. He then turned and walked back down the dark wooden steps into the damp chamber, leaving the young apprentice alone with the stiff horn tool and the immense protective roar of the waterfall outside. The cool moisture of the ravine air settled against Rin's skin, leaving a damp film on his forearms as he sat perfectly still beside the ruined bowl. He remained on the stone terrace for a long time, his eyes fixed on the cracked horn-handled spatula as it rested completely motionless across his knees. A quiet, heavy realization began to filter through the hot stiffness running down the outer seams of his shoulders, a feeling that felt as grounding and spacious as the deep clay vaults below. He saw with sudden clarity that his frantic attempts to curate a flawless image in the sunshine were not a sign of true artistic dedication, but the result of his terror of being rejected by the world. He had been treating his own mind like a wet bowl that had to be constantly defended against the dust of outside opinions, bracing his spirit against the risk of being misinterpreted. Looking at how the simple sumac sap achieved its permanent luster by yielding to a dark, humid enclosure, he began to see that his social exile was an illusion maintained by his own desperate need for validation. The collapse of his work was no longer an absolute disaster to be mourned with shame, but an invitation to let his sensitive nature retreat into its own self-contained depth. This shifting of your internal orientation down into the humid cellar chamber is not a demand that you freeze your emotional core or turn your sensitive spirit into an unfeeling block of wood that registers no pain when a cold word is spoken. It is not an invitation to become entirely numb to the genuine ache of being cast out, or to pretend that the harsh evaluations of your community have no capacity to sting your skin. The deep insights of Buddhist wisdom point toward a much softer, gentler realization about the way we process social injury. When we look closely at our chronic internal bracing, we discover that the true exhaustion does not come from the simple fact that an outside opinion was unearned or a look was cold. The real agony deepens when the mind tries to carry that volatile dust mote around for days, using its own precious energy to continuously re-examine the flaw, demanding that our original nature be instantly vindicated by the very environment that misjudged it. In our everyday struggles, we often mistake a tight, defensive vigilance for a form of necessary self-preservation. We believe that if we continuously analyze the expressions of others, or if we ensure that we never allow our true feelings to be visible without a protective script, we can outrun the pain of rejection. This internal tightening is a form of deep craving, an urgent demand that our immediate environment must completely understand our value before we will ever allow our tired shoulders to relax. When we exist in this state of hypervigilance, we are constantly overtaxing our own emotional structure, leaving no room for the soul to discover the quiet, steady stabilization that runs beneath the shifting judgments of our social circle. Consider how much extra friction you introduce to your tired body when you scold yourself for feeling wounded by a cold interaction during the afternoon. The original moment of misinterpretation was a single, passing event, like a sudden gust of wind blowing a single piece of dried pine needle across an open stone terrace. But the mind immediately panics, treating that passing speck as a permanent proof of your fundamental inadequacy that must be conquered through absolute frantic effort. We light the roaring fire of our internal defense, using it to consume all the remaining energy we have left. We layer an entirely new layer of self-inflicted shame on top of the original isolation, turning a natural human need for understanding into a heavy, burning monument of internal distress. True awareness, within the quiet, shaded corridors of your consciousness, is simply the willingness to notice the exact moment your shoulders lock into that defensive posture of hiding. It is the ability to see the passing critical comment without using your own mind to spin it into an absolute truth about your worth. You recognize the hot prickling along your shoulder blades. You feel the cold weight of exile gathering behind your eyes. But you do not allow that sensation to drag you back into the old narrative of being permanently flawed. You become like the old master lacquerer, stepping away from the wind, realizing that what your spirit needs right now is not a louder argument in the sunshine, but a total relaxation into the deep, damp insulation of your own self-contained presence. This requires an immense sense of compassionate understanding, which is nothing more than the courage to meet your own profound loneliness, without turning it into an indictment against your capacity to belong. Your deep desire for connection, to be seen and free from the terrifying weight of misjudgment, is not a structural weakness, but a naturally tender reflex that simply has nowhere to safely land in this immediate hour. When you catch your mind rehearsing old defenses to prove you were right, you can look at that process with a completely soft, non-judgmental gaze. You can acknowledge that your internal guardian is simply trying to keep you safe from the wind, even if its rigid methods are currently grinding your health down to a raw, unyielding stiffness. The reality of our human identity is inherently subject to change, tied together by a vast, invisible rhythm that moves through our separate lives like the slow binding of the deep resin layers. This underlying lack of a fixed, permanent self can feel deeply intimidating to a mind that has learned to survive only by building an unassailable fortress of reputation. Yet it is also the very womb through which true emotional freedom enters. The heavy, anxious projections that feel so permanent and crushing tonight are actually subject to the same laws of transition as the morning mist in the ravine. They only keep their suffocating weight when we continuously apply the volatile draft of our own obsession. When we drop the rigid demands of our self-reliance, the frantic voices naturally lose their force, relaxing into the wider, dense dark of the internal cellar. Letting go does not mean you pretend your family dynamics do not exist, or that you automatically ignore the practical requirements of your social life. It simply means you stop using your own precious energy to maintain an open conflict inside your bedroom tonight. It is the wisdom to see that you can carry a deep sensitivity for your community without allowing that sensitivity to become a permanent treadmill of exhaustion. You are giving your awareness permission to find its true alignment, not by forcing yourself to catch up to the expectations of a critical crowd, but by trusting the massive damp ground that holds every living vessel in a single quiet stabilization. Slowly, this quiet understanding stops being a distant philosophy, and it begins to touch the immediate texture of your resting body. You start to see that the validation you have been sprinting to reach is not hidden at the end of an endless track of public approval. It is found the very moment you allow your pace to settle, stepping off the treadmill of constant self-protection, even if it is only for the duration of this single dark night. The unpolished wood of your experience can remain precisely as it is, raw and hidden, without threatening your fundamental capacity to be held by the earth. You can choose to be the vast, undisturbed cavern within which the lacquer hardens, completely anchored by an internal stillness that needs no external mirror to authorize its rest. If it feels right inside your body, let us step into a quiet chamber of soft observation together. There is no need to adjust your position with any sense of sudden urgency, or to strive for a rigid ideal of perfection tonight. Simply allow your physical frame to melt into the steady support beneath you, recognizing that right now, you have absolutely no roles to perform and no masks to finalize. The day has already locked its gates. The eyes of judgment have grown quiet across the distance, and the future has not yet arrived to carve its demands into your skin. Perhaps you can bring your attention to the natural, effortless movement of your upper torso. You do not need to deepen your breathing artificially, and there is no requirement to master a complex pattern of inhalation or exhalation right now. Just observe the air as it arrives, cool and nameless, and notice how it departs, carrying a small fraction of your internal friction out into the room. With each quiet release of the breath, you might invite the tight muscles running down the outer seams of your shoulders to unhook, letting the skin across your brow become loose, like a smooth cedar shelf left under a soft light. As you rest here, a specific, heavy thought may drift into the center of your awareness. It might be a memory of a cold look from a family member, a persistent worry about a social misunderstanding, or a quiet sense of frustration for not finding your footing during an interaction this afternoon. Instead of pushing that thought away with anger, and instead of diving into its story to fix it, simply note its presence. Even noticing is enough, for it shows you are no longer drowning in the churning pool of that old anxiety. You can return whenever you are ready to this simple space of observation, letting the mental pattern receive a gentle name, labeling it quietly as masking, or defending, or guarding the wall. Now imagine holding that cracked, rough horn-handled spatula we observed inside Master Sano's damp cellar workshop. Picture its worn, flat edge resting across the open, uncurled palms of your mind, its stiff surface catching the dim, smoky light of the cellar lantern. That heavy tool represents every unvoiced ache, every fear of an uncertain judgment, and every rigid demand for absolute transparency you have been carrying since your youth. That horn spatula is the exact shape of your current emotional fatigue. It is the physical manifestation of your mind trying to smooth over your raw edges through sheer willpower alone, separate from the ground. If it feels safe, try letting that stiff tool drop completely in your mind's eye, picturing it slipping from your fingers and setting down into the deep, damp clay floor with a low, final thud. There is no need to rush this image, and nothing needs to change instantly within your body right now. Just observe what happens when the frantic draft of the open wind is completely cut off, allowing the unsealed vessel to settle into a soft, unweighted space that requires no effort to keep perfect. As that tension leaves your frame, imagine the wide, dark moisture cellar within your upper shoulders beginning to open and expand. Watch the narrow, frantic loops of your defensive thoughts begin to widen out and slow down, merging into the vast, protective walls of a clay bank that requires no effort to contain its shape. With every breath you take, feel that identical softening taking place down through your shoulder blades, along your spine, and into your mattress. The rigid, frozen molds of your ancient accelerations are losing their form, spreading out into a much wider, more supportive landscape of simple presence. The mind does not need to change its history, and you do not need to dissolve your boundaries to find peace tonight. Your presence simply glides there, a quiet, unweighted awareness that makes a low, soothing rhythm as it moves through the open valley spaces. You can let that imagery change now, allowing the damp cellar and the horn tool to dissolve back into the dark background of your mind, leaving only the steady, spacious sensation of your X-ray breathing body. There is absolutely no pressure on you to achieve total emotional clarity or a sudden transformation tonight. Healing is a gradual uncoiling of old internal bracing patterns, not a violent event that happens in a single hour. You are fully permitted to carry a small amount of residual isolation in the background, without needing to analyze it or judge it as a mistake. Just remaining aware of the weight you have been carrying is a profound act of self-preservation. Perhaps you can feel the heavy weight of your shoulder blades sinking deeper into the bedding, letting gravity perform the work of holding you steady without your personal effort. Your hands can remain open, completely empty of tools, fully excused from the work of building a permanent barrier against the wind. You are returning to the uncomplicated truth of the present moment, where the room is safe, the stillness has settled, and the night is slowly unfolding its quiet architecture around your bed. Whenever you are ready, you can simply let your attention rest on the natural boundary, where your breath meets the cool air of the room. You have maintained the tension for many long miles, and you have driven the pace with immense loyalty through the heat of the day. Now, the heavy spatula is dropped. The foundation has found its natural relaxation in the dark, and you are fully permitted to exist without a single script attached to your name. 3 weeks after the open wind had blistered his finest vessel, a heavy mountain mist descended through the high ravine, trapping the woodcutter's village in a thick gray isolation that felt entirely cold and permanent. The small storage racks where Rin used to display his finished wooden boxes sat completely bare, filled with nothing but damp drafts and the smell of wet cedar bark. The young apprentice spent his mornings wandering along the outer walls of the courtyard, his shoulders stiff from the biting river air, his chest tight with a persistent, heavy bitterness. He had refused to apply a single drop of resin to the new bowls, treating the continuous judgments of the village elders as an absolute barrier that had stripped away his social safety and left him entirely exposed to an unpredictable future. He spent hours tracing the rough grain of the unfinished pine wood with a heavy iron scraper, unable to look at his materials without a sharp surge of internal panic. On this cloudy morning, Master Sano did not ask Rin to carve a more elaborate pattern, and he did not instruct him to polish away the blistered surface of the ruined bowls. Instead, the old master lacquerer placed a single strand of wet horsehair into Rin's hands, its dark fiber incredibly fine, cool, and weightless against his calloused palms. Sano quietly requested that Rin descend into the lowest level of the subterranean cellar, where a large crimson storage vessel was sitting undisturbed on a wet cedar tray, and used the single hair to gently lift a microscopic speck of mountain dust that had settled on the curing lip. When Rin heard this request, a hot wave of irritation rushed down the seams of his shoulders, his throat tightening with an intense, defensive reluctance. He felt that working in the damp dark on a tiny imperfection was an admission of total failure, a formal acceptance of a hidden lifestyle that would never allow him to face the public square with pride. He stood at the top of the wooden cellar stairs, his fingers gripping the fine strand of horsehair, his mind spinning a fast web of arguments to avoid the chore. He felt a strong urge to toss the hair into the rushing waterfall and leave the ravine entirely, preferring the cold numbness of his anger over the vulnerability of cooperating with a process he could not accelerate. He looked down into the humid gloom, expecting to find Master Sano watching him with an air of strict authority, but the old vessel keeper was already kneeling near a lower bench, his attention entirely fixed on checking the wet moss beds that lined the foundation walls. Sano's presence was completely quiet and neutral, like a massive block of damp stone that remained undisturbed by the passing mountain fog. Rin closed his eyes for a single slow breath, intentionally choosing to sit with the dizzying surge of social uncertainty, rather than allowing it to dictate his steps. He noted the sharp clenching behind his shoulder blades, recognizing that his defensive urgency was not an absolute truth about his capability, but a protective shield against the pain of being misinterpreted. He stepped down the slick cedar rungs into the damp chamber, lowered his posture over the large crimson vessel, and began a slow, deliberate movement with the wet horsehair brush. He felt the heavy humidity of the vault pressing against his skin as he slid the fine line of the hair under the microscopic speck of dust, lifting it cleanly from the wet resin layer without disturbing the underlying fluid. With each methodical stroke of the fine horsehair, Rin watched the dark surface of the lacquer settle back into its natural alignment, transforming into a deep, liquid mirror that hung motionless in the dim light of the cellar. He worked with a slow, deliberate discipline, that required no immediate answers from the market or the elders, simply clearing the surface step by step in the quiet underground atmosphere. As the tiny speck was completely removed under his steady hand, the internal structure of the curing resin stabilized, settling into a dense, completely self-contained glaze that reflected nothing but the dark timber walls. Rinse breath caught in his throat, his hand stopping mid-movement as he looked at the completely unmarred vessel. Nourished by the dark containment of the airtight chamber, the sensitive sumac sap was not drying out into a brittle crust, but was slowly hardening through the absolute moisture of the cellar into an iron-like shield that would hold its luster for centuries. This rare, durable glaze required the complete exclusion of the open air and a slow, invisible curing process to find its ultimate resilience, meaning it could never have matured in the rapid, bright glare of the public square. The very darkness that Rin had fought with so much fury was the exact condition needed to transform the vulnerable wood into a permanent asset. The slow pacing of the subterranean vault was not a failure of his design, but the opening of a deeper, more resilient resource. He did not instantly become a joyful master of patience, and the memory of his unearned criticism did not vanish from his heart, but a subtle, permanent transformation altered his stance toward his own suffering. He looked down at the single strand of horsehair, no longer seeing it as a symbol of hidden labor, but as a simple tool of partnership with his own sensitive nature. He carefully laid the dark hair against a wet root, wiped the sweet resin from his fingertips, and sat down at the edge of the cedar tray without a single second left to chase in his mind. When we go deeper into the emotional mechanism that sustains our exhaustion, we begin to discover the hidden gears that keep our social suffering in motion. We live under the constant illusion that if we carry ourselves rigidly enough, we can somehow dictate how our image is processed by the minds of those around us. We use our analytical power to rehearse future encounters, to replay past rejections with bitter detail, and to construct elaborate inner scripts to protect our true nature from being exposed to cold eyes. This constant internal labor is driven by an underlying terror of uncertainty, a belief that a sudden misunderstanding or a harsh evaluation by our peers will completely destroy our foundation. We treat our internal space as a trial, where we are simultaneously the defender, the accuser, and the judge, using shame as an aggressive tool to fix our vulnerabilities before anyone else can mock them. This mental pattern is exactly how we convert a passing social injury into a permanent, heavy identity of exclusion. We take the raw, natural pain of being misunderstood by our immediate community, and we immediately wrap it in layers of profound self-judgment. We tell ourselves that if we were truly intelligent, or if we were socially perfect, our interactions would always be smooth and universally validated. We try to secure our fragile sense of belonging by turning our own sensitivity into a crime, hiding our true intent behind a mask of forced agreement to avoid the sting of alienation. In doing so, we become completely trapped in our own defense mechanisms, mistaking the frantic ticking of our anxious thoughts for the absolute reality of who we are. The ancient insights of the Buddha provide a beautiful, liberating distinction that can help your tired shoulders find their true alignment tonight. There is a fundamental difference between the natural friction that life introduces to our relationships and the immense weight of suffering that our resistance adds afterward. The basic unexpected rejections of our social existence, like a sudden cold draft moving down a steep mountain ravine, are simply a part of living. They arrive without our invitation, shaking our emotional stability for a temporary moment, but they do not possess the power to break our core worth. The agony deepens when we refuse to let the world hold its own distorted reflections, when we spend our precious vitality trying to force every critical mind to see us with absolute clarity. Imagine a simple woven wicker screen that has been placed along the bank of a fast river to catch wild reeds. If the rushing river water tosses a single heavy waterlogged branch against the outer weave, the initial impact is just a raw, unpreventable clash of materials. This represents the basic pain that life brings. But if the keeper of the screen panics at the contact and uses his own iron hooks to pull the branch tighter against the fibers, trying to squeeze the water out of the wood through raw strength, The wicker frame will snap and buckle under the compounding pressure of the current. The presence of the floating branch was an accident of the mountain stream, but the desperate demand that the screen must never encounter a rough obstacle is what breaks the wood. This is exactly how our hypervigilance operates within our chest. The original misinterpretation is a passing event, but our immediate, urgent need to override it through internal scolding is what creates the suffocating tightness that keeps us awake at night. True serenity does not require you to live a life where nobody ever misjudges your character, or where your mind never experiences a single ripple of isolation that is an unachievable ideal, a decorative mirage that only forces you to grind your spirit tighter out of frustration. True freedom arrives when you alter your entire relationship with that initial vulnerability, recognizing that you can allow the unpolished opinions of others to exist without turning them into a personal failure. You can notice the sudden surge of a defensive thought. You can feel the old urge to mask rising in your throat, and you can simply let that energy move through your space without treating it as an absolute emergency. You are no longer trying to force your reputation to look like a permanent stone monument, for you are learning to trust the raw, uncarved nature that anchors you underneath the noise. When you step off the treadmill of constant self-fixation, you discover that you do not need to use shame to manage your internal world. Your fear of being rejected by your community is not an enemy to be conquered, but an overstimulated guardian that simply needs to be shown the quiet, damp moisture waiting in the cellar below. By allowing your awareness to drop down into that lower settled chamber, you give the old ancestral bracing permission to naturally disperse. You stop interpreting your social exhaustion as a personal defect, and you start seeing it as a temporary, moving part within a much larger, more spacious architecture. The world may continue to hold its mistaken impressions for a little while longer, but the core of your being remains entirely unbothered, resting heavily in its own silent gravity. This internal masking does not only manifest within a hidden mountain workshop during a heavy ravine fog. It mirrors itself continuously in the quiet, contemporary landscapes of your everyday routine. You experience this rigid momentum every time you glance down at your phone, watching a blank notification screen, waiting for an answer that does not arrive, feeling the muscles along the seams of your shoulders tighten as the digital silence grows louder. It happens when you lie perfectly still at midnight, replaying a minor misstep from an earlier professional interaction, turning the key of your self-criticism until your shoulder blades feel stiff with regret. You feel it when you look at the seemingly seamless achievements of your peers online, concluding that your own quiet, unpolished life is a definitive failure. We carry an immense amount of unvoiced pressure while moving through our modern schedules, offering a smooth, polite smile to our companions while our internal space is vibrating with the fear of being cast out. We try to micromanage the emotional climate of our relationships, hoping that if we can just control every external variable, we can prevent our hearts from being fractured by a sudden misunderstanding. We look to our devices for a brief hit of reassurance, trying to use a glass screen to patch over a somatic tremor that actually requires deep, uncarved space. When we finally do give ourselves permission to sit down or close our eyes, a fierce wave of historical guilt instantly arises, whispering that stillness is a luxury we have not yet produced enough social success to deserve. Bringing this ancient, mud-sealed cellar wisdom into your daily reality means discovering how to introduce a small pause before you allow an old reaction to claim your body. It means that when a sudden panic tells you to over-prepare for a routine interaction, you stop for the duration of a single, unhurried breath. You do not try to crush the protective impulse, and you do not scold yourself for feeling separate. You simply observe the frantic energy rising behind your ribs, recognizing it as an old inherited script trying to dictate your current posture. By giving that pattern a moment of open visibility, you choose not to obey its rigid command, allowing the churning sediment to settle before it can warp your entire evening. You can care intensely about your commitments, your loved ones, and your future without pressing your fingers so tightly against your boundaries that your mind turns to absolute ice. True stability is practicing the art of moving through your duties with a loose, flexible grip, understanding that you can offer your presence without needing to guarantee a perfectly static outcome. When you feel the familiar urge to perform arising, you can remember the raw, unpolished wooden vessel that cures its resin beautifully, precisely because it connects to the deep moisture. You can allow your awareness to drop below the internal commentary of your critics, anchoring yourself in the solid, unembellished center of your own immediate reality. You do not need to check a single box or fulfill a single expectation to qualify for a period of absolute non-doing tonight. Rest is not a decorative prize reserved for the flawless achiever, but the very cavern of clear water that keeps your internal slate clean and resilient over the years. When you let your limbs sink into the bed without demanding a blueprint for next week, you are letting the heavy stone monument of your reputation drop completely into the dark ground. You are allowing the micro-components of your consciousness to find their natural clearance, not by forcing them to look perfect, but by trusting the vast, unwritten space that naturally exists when the old tool is set down. This subtle shift in your daily rhythm does not mean your life will suddenly become free of challenging conversations, unexpected delays, or real human weight. The world will continue to present you with unpredictable seasons, complicated dynamics, and moments of profound uncertainty. But you will no longer meet those moments by locking your joints into a state of brittle compliance. You will discover that you can stand in the middle of a demanding week with a soft, spacious heart, moving through your hours with a measured, unhurried gait. You are slowly learning to exist as the wide, raw vault within which the silence is guided, fully anchored by an internal peace that needs no external validation to authorize its existence. The quiet, moisture-sealed cellar vault is fading now into the complete dark stillness of the midnight hour. Deep within the ravine slopes, the humid air has settled into an absolute equilibrium, absorbing the tiny echoes of the high, rushing waterfall until the chamber feels entirely soft, insulated, and silent. The single strand of wet horsehair has finished its labor, resting empty and weightless on the wood bench, its dark fiber completely separated from the finished vessel. The crimson storage bowl has found its place on the damp cedar tray, its unhurried hardening proceeding without a single sound or open glare. There are no more surfaces to expand, no more blistered layers to evaluate, and no more defensive masks to plan before the community above begins its morning routine. Your physical form is becoming incredibly heavy, sinking down into the supportive expanse of your bedding like a dense vessel, losing its external friction, and settling perfectly flat into a deep blanket of protective shadow. Let the sensitive muscles running down the outer seams of your shoulders and around the borders of your shoulder blades unhook completely, releasing the hidden, prickling tightness that kept your upper body in a state of perpetual exile through the demanding hours of the day. Your limbs rest slack and empty of momentum, abandoning the old, frantic habit of defending your character in a world that feels too critical to manage. Your chest is perfectly soft, your spine widening against the mattress, fully excused from the lifelong labor of chasing after public approval through sheer willpower alone. Your breathing has slowed to a faint, effortless rhythm, a quiet movement that matches the deep, timeless curing of the resin vessels hidden far down in the damp clay banks. Each quiet inhalation is a soft arrival in a sanctuary where you are already completely visible to your own center, and each quiet exhalation is the slow, smooth leveling of the internal trials that kept your spirit tightly bound. You are no longer measuring your social achievements. You are no longer replaying your past misunderstandings. And you are no longer checking your mind to see if you have produced enough perfection to earn your rest. The entire theater of your isolation has dissolved into the shadows, leaving you completely nameless, unmeasured, and free within the deep dark. The deep wisdom of the sealed cellar is drifting quietly into the center of your heart, bypassing your analytical thoughts entirely. You are absorbing the profound comfort of the slow hardening resin layers, realizing that your true stability was never the rapid, bright image you were trying so hard to maintain in the open wind. You are letting the hidden, silent depths of your existence simply move through the darkness, dropping down beneath the memory of your rejections into the immense womb of the earth. You have absolute permission to stop solving your life for tonight, for there are no social scripts to maintain in this quiet room, and no distorted mirrors waiting to be corrected before your eyes are allowed to close. The world can continue its complex, demanding choreography when the sun returns. But your inner sanctuary remains entirely unbothered, resting heavily in its own silent gravity. You are allowed to slip away into the unwritten dark that remains when the heavy armor of your masking is left on the cedar floorboards. The dust has cleared completely from the terrace, the chamber is quiet, and the vast protective architecture of the night is fully prepared to shelter your sleep without requiring a single explanation in return. Let the final lines of your alienation soften until they blend into the quiet, damp stillness of the earth. Perhaps your true nature has always carried its own perfect shield, entirely unconcerned with whether the wind ever learns to name its color. The vast, velvet dark of the room takes that question into its heavy fold, absorbing it completely until any remaining need for an answer dissolves into the quiet rhythm of the evening. The mind, which has spent so many seasons acting as a vigilant guardian at the gate, finally realizes that it can step down from its guard post without leaving you unprotected. For a long time, you believed that if you did not carefully monitor the impressions of those around you, your entire sense of security would fracture and collapse into the cold space of isolation. You treated your own internal landscape as an ongoing project that required constant polishing, constant adjusting, and constant defense against the unpredictable currents of outside opinion. Yet, within this humid and deeply grounded sanctuary of the night, the heavy stillness reveals that your fundamental worth is not a fragile thing to be broken by a passing glance or an unearned judgment. It simply sits there, deep and unyielding, matching the ancient density of the clay bank behind the waterfall. Let your shoulder blades expand a fraction more against the bedding, allowing the dense, supportive surface beneath you to absorb the absolute physical weight of your posture. There is no requirement to analyze how well you are letting go tonight, and no invisible evaluator is standing in the corner of this room to measure the clarity of your meditation. The raw wood of your experience is fully permitted to remain exactly as it is, unmapped and hidden away from the volatile draft of the public square. When the habit of replaying an old conversation tries to surface within your forehead, you do not have to fight it with anger or force it to become silent. You can simply notice it as a small, stray vibration, letting it pass through your space like a single drop of mountain mist, sliding harmlessly across a cold slate floor, completely unable to leave a permanent mark on the stone. Think of how the ancient, dark timbers of the cellar walls feel during these silent midnight hours, when the village above has grown completely dark, and the cold river current moves steadily through the ravine. The heavy beams do not alter their position because a storm is rattling the cedar branches on the ridge, and they do not carry a sense of panic because the daytime workers misunderstood their placement. They merely rest in the deep, moist dark, holding the space with an immovable, foundational confidence that requires no external mirrors to authorize its presence. You can allow your deepest nature to align with that same undisturbed gravity tonight, letting the soft blanket of the evening mute the lingering echoes of your social fatigue until your mind is as quiet and unbothered as the deep earth beneath the moss. The liberating understanding that your true identity is a fluid, continuous stream rather than a rigid monument to be defended is settling into the very marrow of your bones now, filling your limbs with a comforting, liquid weight. You are finally realizing that the integrity of your journey does not depend on making your character universally understood, but on your willingness to stop treating an unearned critique as an absolute catastrophe. By letting the opinions of the world find their own level, without throwing a single wall of resistance in their path, you have dismantled the hidden machinery of your hypervigilance, allowing your original, uncarved center to rise softly to the surface. The public stages and the missing explanations can remain precisely where they fell, untied and unpolished, without casting a single shadow over your fundamental capacity to be held by the dark. Let the total darkness of the evening wrap itself around your awareness, like a seamless protective garment that carries no seams and no restrictions. There is no longer any digital screen to check for reassurance, no social role to rewrite in the theater of your imagination, and no comparison loop to run through your mind before your limbs are permitted to go completely slack. The world beyond your room may continue its complex, demanding judgments, but within this quiet pocket of warmth, you are entirely exempt from the performance. You are the wide open sky within which the storm has finally run its course, a vast, unchanging backdrop that remains perfectly serene and whole whether the clouds are heavy or light. With every slow, quiet breath that slides past your lips, feel yourself drifting further away from the rigid names and definitions that kept your identity bound to the wheel of constant masking. Your hands are perfectly open, your wrists are completely loose, and the long, tense lines of anxiety inside your forearms have dissolved into a smooth, liquid comfort that pulls you down into the deep velvet of the midnight hour. You are returning to the uncomplicated truth of your own baseline existence, a deep, primitive sanctuary that has never been scratched or diminished by the evaluations of others, or the sudden blockages of your social journey. The night has opened its most silent, timeless chambers to receive your weariness, offering you a place where you can exist without a single script left to justify your place on this quiet earth. As the final faint images of the subterranean vault and the elderly vessel keeper dissolve into the deep, dark current of your resting mind, the entire world outside seems to draw a single, collective breath of absolute surrender. The iron tools are cold, the horsehair strand is loose, the rough horn spatula has settled completely in its clay basin, and the entire landscape has found its perfect equilibrium under the silent night. There is nothing left to guard against, nothing left to fix, and no masterpiece left to prove your right to inhabit this spacious dark. You are fully permitted to let go of the tapestry, allowing your heart to follow the slow, steady rhythm of the night as it carries you home into a profound, dreamless, and unmeasured sleep. This deep, dreamless rest expands even further, lengthening the hidden spaces of your consciousness until every remaining thread of tension is entirely unraveled by the heavy quiet of the room. You are sinking past the layer of memories, past the unfinished blueprints of your daily work, and past the persistent urge to evaluate how well you are adapting to this quiet chapter of your existence. The analytical mind has finally run out of arguments, choosing to abandon its long post at the watchtower, recognizing that it no longer needs to defend a fort that was never truly in danger of collapsing. You are letting your entire identity drop down into the cool, silent depths of the present moment, allowing the unfamiliar contours of your reality to just exist without requiring a single explanation from the dark. Let the heavy, soothing warmth of this total non-resistance travel up through the base of your skull, releasing the tiny, subconscious bracing patterns that gather when you are trying to force your thoughts into a rigid alignment. Your eyes are completely soft behind their lids. Your breathing has slowed to a long, rhythmic glide, and the invisible weight that lived behind your collarbones has completely flattened into a loose, unhurried wave of pure presence. There are no sudden transformations waiting to surprise you in the corners of this space, and no invisible judges are standing over your bed to measure the speed of your emotional recovery. You have crossed the threshold into an ancient, timeless domain where your only task is to let the mattress take the absolute physical burden of your frame, letting gravity carry you forward while the world continues its slow, unmapped turning in the shadows. Think of how the vast bedrock beneath the mountain terrace feels during these quiet, midnight hours when the cold rain has ceased and the heavy mist has completely swallowed the outlines of the stone walls. The solid stone does not shift its placement because the surface mud moved during the storm, and it does not carry a sense of panic because the old drainage ditches are filled with silt. It simply remains exactly where it has always been, an immovable foundational presence that accepts the changing weight of the seasons without a single ripple of internal friction. You can allow your deepest nature to match that same undisturbed stability tonight, letting the dark blanket of the evening mute the lingering echoes of your daytime anxieties until your mind is as quiet and unbothered as the deep mountain granite. The ancient understanding that true peace is found not in removing the current, but in changing your relationship to its movement, is settling into the very marrow of your bones now, filling your body with a deep, comforting density that needs no validation from the past to authorize its rest. You are finally realizing that the integrity of your journey does not depend on keeping your life perfectly static, but on your willingness to stop treating an unexpected shift as a personal catastrophe. By letting the stream find its new level without throwing a single wall in its path, you have dismantled the hidden machinery of your panic, allowing your true, uncarved center to rise softly to the surface. The unmapped roads and the missing answers can remain precisely where they fell, untied and unpolished, without casting a single shadow over your fundamental worth. Let the total darkness of the evening wrap itself around your awareness like a heavy, seamless garment that carries no seams and no restrictions. There is no longer any digital screen to check for reassurance, no old routine to rewrite in the theater of your imagination, and no comparison loop to run through your mind before your limbs are permitted to go completely slack. The world beyond your window pane may continue its complex, demanding movements, but within this quiet pocket of warmth, you are entirely exempt from the performance. You are the wide open sky within which the storm has finally run its course, a vast, unchanging backdrop that remains perfectly serene and whole whether the clouds are heavy or light. With every slow, quiet breath that slides past your lips, feel yourself drifting further away from the rigid names and definitions that kept your identity bound to the wheel of constant productivity. Your hands are perfectly open, your wrists are completely loose, and the long, tense lines of anxiety inside your forearms have dissolved into a smooth, liquid comfort that pulls you down into the deep velvet of the midnight hour. You are returning to the uncomplicated truth of your own baseline existence, a deep, primitive sanctuary that has never been scratched or diminished by the evaluations of others or the sudden blockages of your creative journey. The night has opened its most silent, timeless chambers to receive your weariness, offering you a place where you can exist without a single goal left to justify your place on this quiet earth. As the final faint images of the subterranean vault and the elderly vessel keeper dissolve into the deep, dark current of your resting mind, the entire world outside seems to draw a single, collective breath of absolute surrender. The iron tools are cold, the horsehair strand is loose, the rough-horned spatula has settled completely in its clay basin, and the entire landscape has found its perfect equilibrium under the silent night. There is nothing left to guard against, nothing left to fix, and no masterpiece left to prove your right to inhabit this spacious dark. You are fully permitted to let go of the tapestry, allowing your heart to follow the slow, steady rhythm of the night as it carries you home into a profound, dreamless, and unmeasured sleep. The heavy density of this quietude expands even further, reaching into the hidden crevices of your awareness, where the last remnants of social vigilance have been holding their breath. You are letting go of the need to verify if you have been fully understood by the world, recognizing that the space you inhabit tonight is entirely self-contained, requiring no outside mirrors to justify its existence. The persistent urge to reevaluate how your actions were interpreted by others has lost its grip, dropping away like dry leaves falling into a still valley stream. You are sinking down past the layer of public expectations, past the mental rehearsals of tomorrow's conversations, and past the deep fatigue of carrying a false front against the wind. The analytical mind has completely abandoned its defense of your reputation, understanding that within this dark shelter, your true nature is already entirely whole and safe from judgment. Let the soothing, humid calm of this non-resistance soften the outer seams of your shoulders, releasing the tiny, subconscious bracing patterns that accumulate when you are trying to force your spirit into a rigid alignment with a critical community. Your chest is completely soft, your breathing has slowed to a long, rhythmic glide, and the invisible weight that lived behind your shoulder blades has completely flattened into a loose, unhurried wave of pure presence. There are no sudden evaluations waiting to surprise you in the corners of this sanctuary, and no hidden judges are standing over your bed to measure the speed of your emotional recovery. You have crossed the threshold into an ancient, timeless domain where your only task is to let the bed take the absolute physical burden of your frame, letting gravity carry you forward while the world continues its slow, unmapped turning in the shadows. Think of how the vast clay bank beneath the ravine terrace feels during these quiet midnight hours, when the rushing waterfall has ceased its loud echo and the heavy mist has completely swallowed the outlines of the stone walls. The solid earth does not shift its placement because the surface wind moved through the trees, and it does not carry a sense of panic because the daytime workers misunderstood its form. It simply remains exactly where it has always been, an immovable foundational presence that accepts the changing weight of the seasons without a single ripple of internal friction. You can allow your deepest nature to match that same undisturbed stability tonight, letting the dark blanket of the evening mute the lingering echoes of your social anxieties until your mind is as quiet and unbothered as the deep subterranean clay. The ancient understanding that true protection is found not in changing the opinions of others, but in changing your relationship to their movement is settling into the very marrow of your bones now, filling your body with a deep, comforting density that needs no validation from the past to authorize its rest. You are finally realizing that the integrity of your journey does not depend on keeping your reputation perfectly static, but on your willingness to stop treating an unearned critique as an absolute catastrophe. By letting the stream of public thought find its own level without throwing a single wall of resistance in its path, you have dismantled the hidden machinery of your panic, allowing your true, uncarved center to rise softly to the surface. The unmapped roads and the missing explanations can remain precisely where they fell, untied and unpolished, without casting a single shadow over your fundamental worth. Let the total darkness of the evening wrap itself around your awareness like a heavy, seamless garment that carries no seams and no restrictions. There is no longer any digital screen to check for reassurance, no social role to rewrite in the theater of your imagination, and no comparison loop to run through your mind before your limbs are permitted to go completely slack. The world beyond your window pane may continue its complex, demanding movements, but within this quiet pocket of warmth, you are entirely exempt from the performance. You are the wide, open sky within which the storm has finally run its course, a vast, unchanging backdrop that remains perfectly serene and whole, whether the clouds are heavy or light. With every slow, quiet breath that slides past your lips, feel yourself drifting further away from the rigid names and definitions that kept your identity bound to the wheel of constant masking. Your hands are perfectly open, your wrists are completely loose, and the long, tense lines of anxiety inside your forearms have dissolved into a smooth, liquid comfort that pulls you down into the deep velvet of the midnight hour. You are returning to the uncomplicated truth of your own baseline existence, a deep, primitive sanctuary that has never been scratched or diminished by the evaluations of others or the sudden blockages of your social journey. The night has opened its most silent, timeless chambers to receive your weariness, offering you a place where you can exist without a single script left to justify your place on this quiet earth. As the final, faint images of the subterranean vault and the elderly vessel keeper dissolve into the deep, dark current of your resting mind, the entire world outside seems to draw a single collective breath of absolute surrender. The iron tools are cold, the horsehair strand is loose, the rough horn spatula has settled completely in its clay basin, and the entire landscape has found its perfect equilibrium under the silent night. There is nothing left to guard against, nothing left to fix, and no masterpiece left to prove your right to inhabit this spacious dark. You are fully permitted to let go of the tapestry, allowing your heart to follow the slow, steady rhythm of the night as it carries you home into a profound, dreamless, and unmeasured sleep.